Can the Prime Minister tell us, did the official security vetting he received mention Mandelson's ongoing relationship with the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein?
If that question doesn't get your attention, nothing will. Because this wasn't some routine exchange in Parliament. This was a direct challenge, right at the centre of government. What did the Prime Minister know, and when did he know it? That's what Kemi Badenoch asked Keir Starmer. And it's the one question his government still hasn't properly answered. Not clearly, not directly. And that's the problem, because this isn't about political point scoring. It's about judgment at the very top. At the centre of it all is Peter Mandelson, appointed to represent Britain in Washington, one of the most sensitive roles the UK has. A role that depends on credibility, on trust, on judgment. And almost immediately the same issue came back into focus, his past association with Jeffrey Epstein, something that has been publicly known for years. Now let's be absolutely clear. There is no evidence that Mandelson was involved in any criminal wrongdoing, but that's not what this is about. This is about the decision to appoint him anyway, because when something like that is already in the public domain, you don't get to ignore it, especially not at this level. And yet, when concerns were raised, the government didn't step back. It defended the decision, publicly, in Parliament, with full confidence. And that's where this starts to fall apart, because once you stand by a decision like that, you don't just own the appointment, you own the consequences as well.
To appoint Epstein's close associate, Peter Mandelson, as Britain's ambassador to Washington goes to the very heart of this Prime Minister's judgment.
And this is where it gets difficult to explain, because by the time the Prime Minister stood up in Parliament and backed Peter Mandelson, concerns had already been raised, not afterwards, at the time. And that matters, because it means this wasn't a decision made without warning. The issue was already there, already being talked about, already in the public domain. And yet, he backed it. No hesitation, no qualification, just full confidence. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why? Was he advised that it wasn't an issue, and trusted that advice? Or did he know the risks were there and decide to go ahead anyway? Because those are the only two explanations that really make sense. Either the information didn't carry the weight it should have, or the judgment didn't hold up under pressure, and neither one is comfortable. Because if the warning signs were already there, then standing up in Parliament and defending the decision becomes much harder to justify. And that's why this doesn't just go away. Because once a decision like that is publicly backed, and then comes under pressure, people start looking back at that moment. What was known, what was said, and why it was defended so strongly in the first place.
We're doing everything we can to make sure this is fully transparent and disclosed, but she and those behind her will understand from their own experience in government.
At this point, the focus shifts, because this isn't just about what happened, it's about how it was allowed to happen in the first place, and that's where the situation narrows down. There are only a few explanations. Either the vetting process didn't flag concerns that were already out there, or the information was there, but it never properly reached the Prime Minister, or the concerns were known, and the decision was made anyway. That's it. And none of those are easy to defend, because this isn't a minor role. This is a senior diplomatic appointment, one of the most high-profile positions the UK has. So if something like this wasn't picked up, that's a serious failure. If it was known but not passed on, that's a breakdown inside government. And if it was known and the decision was still made, then it comes down to judgment. And that's where the pressure now sits, because whichever way you look at it, this doesn't just point to one mistake, it points to a decision that doesn't fully add up.
Did he know that Mandelson had continued his friendship with Epstein after the conviction? He says if he knew then what he knows now, but he did know.
And this is where the timeline starts to matter, because what's being said now doesn't fully match what was said at the time. The Prime Minister stood in Parliament and backed the appointment. Clearly, directly, no hesitation. But now we're hearing that further information changed the situation afterwards. And that's where the problem is, because if concerns were already out there, already being raised, then what exactly changed? What was understood then that isn't being defended now? Because the sequence matters. Decision, defense, then pressure. And once that sequence is clear, people start looking back at that moment in Parliament. Because if the concerns were already known at that point, then the defense we saw becomes much harder to explain. And that's why this doesn't quite line up. Because if the timeline doesn't add up, the explanation doesn't either.
What was not known was the depth, the sheer depth and extent of the relationship. He lied about that to everyone for years.
And this is where it stops being just a bad decision and starts becoming a political problem. Because in politics, mistakes happen. What matters is how you deal with them. And right now, that's where this starts to hurt, because the story has shifted. At first, there was confidence. Now there's distance. And when that happens, people notice. Because if concerns existed earlier, even at a basic level, then the government still needs to explain what changed. What made that decision acceptable then, and not acceptable now? And that gap is where the pressure builds. Because once a government starts moving from defense to distance, it tells you something. It tells you the ground has shifted. And when that happens, it's no longer just about the original decision. It's about whether the explanation still holds.
So did the Prime Minister conveniently forget this fact, or did he decide it was a risk worth taking?
And this is where it lands. Because this isn't something that just disappears after one statement. The question is too simple. What did the Prime Minister know? And why did he back the decision? And until that's answered properly, this doesn't settle, because every version of the explanation still leaves something open. Either the concerns were already there, in which case the defense needs explaining, or they weren't fully understood, in which case the process needs explaining. Either way, something doesn't quite add up, and that's why this keeps coming back, because this is no longer just about Peter Mandelson, it's about judgment, at the very top, and whether decisions like this are being made the way people expect, because once that doubt is there, it doesn't just disappear, and right now, that doubt isn't going anywhere.